A housekeeper was sentenced to life in prison for stealing million-dollar jewelry from the mansion. During the hearing, the youngest daughter of the family ran in with a recording that left everyone stunned. The gentle aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the spacious kitchen of the mansion as Evangeline, the 55-year-old governess, moved with the familiarity of someone who knew every corner of that environment. Her graying hair was always tied in a discreet bun, and the impeccably white apron stood out against her navy blue dress. With precise and delicate gestures, she organized the breakfast tray, taking special care with little 8-year-old Emmeline's favorite cup, decorated with colorful drawings. "Emmeline, my love, come have your hot chocolate before it gets cold," Evangeline called, her face lighting up as she saw the girl running into the kitchen, still in her pajamas and with tousled hair. Emmeline hugged Evangeline's waist tightly, her round little face overflowing with joy, as the governess tenderly fixed her dark hair. The two had developed a special connection over the years, filling the void that the constant absence of Vivian, the ever-busy mother with social events, had created. "Evangeline, tell me again the story of the enchanted prince who turned into a frog," Emmeline pleaded, sitting at the kitchen table as the governess served her hot chocolate with precisely 3 cookies, just the way the girl liked it. Evangeline smiled, preparing for another session of storytelling that so enchanted the little one. Vivian Hargrove watched the scene from the kitchen doorway, her red-painted lips pursed into a tense line. Her emerald green, cold eyes followed every move the governess made with growing irritation. The diamond ring on her finger spun nervously as she witnessed the intimacy between her daughter and the employee. "So why can't Emmeline simply have breakfast in the dining room, like a girl of her standing should?" she thought, adjusting her perfectly coiffed blonde hair. The sound of her daughter's laughter with the governess seemed to scratch at her ears like nails on a blackboard. Evangeline noticed Vivian's presence, and her demeanor subtly shifted. Years of experience had taught her to read her mistress's moods, and today there was something different, something more intense in the air. She continued preparing the family's breakfast with the same efficiency, but her movements became more restrained, more cautious. "Mrs. Vivian, breakfast is served in the main dining room. I've prepared those rolls Mr. Sterling so enjoys," Evangeline said, referring to Vivian's absent husband, keeping the professional tone she always used with her mistress. The atmosphere in the kitchen, once light and welcoming, now seemed charged with a palpable tension. Emmeline, sensitive to atmospheric changes as only children can be, lowered the volume of her laughter, but remained close to Evangeline. The governess continued her tasks, alternating discreet smiles at Emmeline with watchful glances towards Vivian, who remained standing in the doorway like an ice statue, observing every detail with an interest that went beyond a mistress's normal supervision. "Emmeline, dear, finish your breakfast. Your piano lesson starts in 20 minutes, Evangeline gently reminded, trying to maintain the normalcy of the routine. Vivian finally entered the kitchen, her high heels marking each step like an unrelenting metronome on the marble floor. The expensive, intense perfume she wore began to overpower the aroma of coffee, creating a stifling mixture in the environment. She stopped beside her daughter, her perfectly manicured nails drumming on the surface of the kitchen table. "Evangeline, after breakfast, I need you to organize my closet, especially the jewelry section. I noticed some irregularities," Vivian said, her words coming out like ice cubes, making Evangeline feel an involuntary shiver run down her spine. Evangeline's smile faltered for a moment, but she maintained the professional composure that years of service had perfected. Emmeline looked from one to the other, her little brow furrowed in confusion at the tension she didn't fully understand. The governess began gathering some used cups, her movements now more mechanical, as she responded in a controlled voice. "Certainly, Mrs. Vivian. As soon as I finish organizing breakfast and take Emmeline to her piano lesson, I will devote all my attention to your closet." Vivian watched every move the governess made with hawkish eyes, her presence dominating the environment like a growing shadow. The morning sun streaming through the kitchen window seemed unable to dispel the darkness settling in the air. Emmeline, finishing her hot chocolate, held Evangeline's hand under the table, instinctively feeling that her beloved governess needed comfort. "Mommy, can Evangeline tell me another story before piano class?" Emmeline asked hopefully, her childlike voice cutting through the tense silence like a bell in an empty cathedral. Vivian's response was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Not today, dear. Evangeline has many responsibilities to attend to." Her gaze met the governess's, and in that moment Evangeline felt as if she was staring into the abyss. Something was about to happen, something that would forever change the peace of that seemingly ordinary morning. "In fact," Vivian continued, her voice taking on a tone Evangeline had never heard before, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation about responsibilities and trust, don't we, Evangeline?" The silence in the kitchen grew denser as Vivian approached the table where her work bag was. Evangeline kept her hands busy cleaning the counter, trying to control the tremor that was beginning to manifest in her fingers. Emmeline remained seated, her big eyes alternating between her mother and her beloved governess, feeling the growing tension in the air. "Evangeline," Vivian pronounced each syllable as if they were little stabs. "Where is my wristwatch? The one that was on my dressing table last night." Evangeline turned slowly, facing her mistress's accusing gaze with dignity. Her 20 years of dedicated service to the family seemed to weigh on her shoulders at that moment. "Mrs. Vivian, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't touch any watch," she replied, her voice trembling but firm as she wiped her hands on her immaculately white apron. Emmeline hugged her teddy bear tighter, feeling fear growing in her little heart. Vivian moved like a predator circling its prey, her heels echoing on the kitchen floor like an ominous prelude. Her green eyes flickered with contained rage as she approached Evangeline's purse, hanging discreetly on a hook near the back door. "You know, Evangeline, I trusted you for all these years. I let you take care of my house, my daughter." Her voice trembled slightly at the mention of Emmeline. "But lately I've noticed small disappearances. First it was a pair of earrings, then a brooch, and now my watch." Evangeline's face visibly paled as Vivian picked up her purse. "Ma'am, please," she began, her voice almost a whisper. "I've worked for this family for 2 decades. I would never—" Her words were brutally interrupted by the sound of the purse being opened violently. Vivian began to rummage through its contents, tossing the governess's personal belongings onto the table. A small mirror, a used lipstick, an embroidered handkerchief, some carefully folded banknotes. Emmeline rose from her chair, tears beginning to form in her childish eyes. "Mum, stop. Evangeline would never take anything of yours," the girl protested, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. Vivian ignored her daughter's pleas, continuing her frantic search. Evangeline remained paralyzed as if her feet had taken root on the kitchen floor, watching her privacy being violated before her eyes. "Mrs. Vivian, if you allow me to explain." She tried again, but her words seemed unable to penetrate the barrier of suspicion that Vivian had erected. The sound of metal against metal echoed through the kitchen as Vivian turned the purse upside down, dumping its remaining contents onto the table. Among the last items that fell, something shone with a golden reflection in the morning light. Time seemed to freeze as all eyes fixed on the object. There, among crumpled keys and receipts, was the missing watch. Vivian picked up the piece with trembling fingers, her eyes burning with cruel triumph. "So, Evangeline, are you still going to deny it?" Evangeline felt her legs weaken, needing to lean on the kitchen counter to keep from falling. Her face took on a deathly pallor as she stared fixedly at the watch, unable to understand its presence among her belongings. This is impossible," she mumbled, her voice barely coming out. I would never." Emmeline began to cry openly, running to hug the governess. But Vivian pulled her away roughly by the arm, keeping her away from Evangeline. The shrill sound of the telephone cut through the tense air of the kitchen. Vivian, still holding Emmeline with one hand and the watch with the other, smiled a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think I know who's calling," she said, her voice heavy with cruel satisfaction. "It must be the police, who I called as soon as I noticed the watch was missing. I knew you wouldn't resist the temptation to take something else before leaving, Evangeline. People like you always show their true nature." Evangeline felt the world spinning around her, her decades of dedication crumbling like a house of cards. Her eyes met Emmeline's, who was crying silently in her mother's firm grip. "Emmeline, my love," Evangeline whispered, her voice choked. "You know I would never." But before she could finish, the sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, approaching the mansion. Vivian let out a short, humorless laugh as she adjusted her hair with her free hand. "Well, Evangeline, I guess it's time for you to pay for your crimes." The sound of sirens grew louder with every second, and Evangeline could feel her heart pounding so hard it seemed like it wanted to escape her chest. Emmeline kept crying, now sobbing openly, while Vivienne maintained a satisfied smile on her face. The governess looked one more time at the watch on the table, an object she had never seen before that moment, and felt a wave of dizziness sweep over her. Vivienne's words echoed in her mind. "People like you always show their true nature." And for the first time in 20 years, Evangeline felt not only fear, but also a profound sense of betrayal that left her speechless. The sound of sirens invaded the mansion like a storm, tinting the kitchen walls with the flashes of red and blue lights. Evangeline remained motionless, her hands clutching the white apron that now seemed to weigh a ton. The aroma of breakfast coffee still lingered in the air, mingling with Vivienne's expensive perfume, creating a suffocating atmosphere. Emmeline kept crying, her sobs echoing through the kitchen as she tried to break free from her mother's firm grip. "Evangeline's not a thief, Mom. She can't be a thief!" the girl screamed, her childish voice filled with despair. Vivienne maintained a satisfied smile on her red-painted lips, holding the watch as if it were a trophy. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching the back entrance made Evangeline visibly tremble. The governess looked at her hands, the same hands that for 20 years had prepared meals, made beds, dried tears, and offered comforting hugs in that house. "How can this be happening?" she thought, feeling a dizziness that threatened to knock her down. The marble floor beneath her feet seemed to sway like a boat on turbulent waters. 2 police officers entered the kitchen, their immaculate uniforms contrasting with the emotional chaos of the scene. Vivienne immediately stepped forward, her posture emanating authority. "This is her, gentlemen. I found this valuable watch in her bag, along with other jewels that had gone missing," she declared, her voice laced with venom as she extended the watch as evidence. Evangeline felt her heart stop for a moment. Other jewels? What other jewels? Her bewildered gaze met Emmeline's, who was still struggling in her mother's grip. The officers approached Evangeline, who instinctively took a step back, her back hitting the kitchen counter. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us," one of them said, his voice professional and distant. The other officer began to search Evangeline's bag more thoroughly, and to the governess's horror, he began to remove more jewels. A pair of diamond earrings, a pearl necklace, a golden brooch. Objects she had never seen before emerged from her simple bag like a macabre magic trick. Emmeline finally managed to break free from Vivienne's grip and ran towards Evangeline, but was stopped by one of the officers. The girl screamed and cried, her face red with anguish. "Evangeline, Evangeline, don't let them take you, please, Mommy, make them stop." Vivienne grabbed her daughter again, this time with more force, whispering something in her ear that made the girl's eyes widen and fall suddenly silent, although tears continued to silently stream down her face. As the officers prepared to handcuff her, Evangeline noticed something strange in Emmeline's behavior. The girl had stopped struggling and was now staring at her with a different expression, a mixture of fear and guilt. For a brief moment their gazes met, and Evangeline felt her heart tighten as she saw the little girl quickly avert her eyes, as if unable to sustain that eye contact. There was something there, something important that she couldn't understand amidst the whirlwind of emotions. The cold metal of the handcuffs closed around Evangeline's wrists, the sound of the click echoing through the kitchen like a final sentence. Vivienne smoothed her hair with one hand, keeping Emmeline close with the other, her triumphant smile even more pronounced. "You see, dear," she said to her daughter, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's why we can't trust people like her. They always disappoint us in the end." Evangeline felt the words like stabs in her heart, but something about Emmeline's reaction troubled her even more than the accusations. The officers began to lead Evangeline out of the kitchen, passing by the table where the breakfast cups were still sitting, Emmeline's hot chocolate half finished, the cookies unfinished. 20 years of her life reduced to this moment of humiliation and confusion. As she was being led away, Evangeline looked back one last time, her eyes meeting Emmeline's again. The girl was now biting her lower lip hard, as she always did when she was hiding something, and it was then that Evangeline realized there was more to this story than it seemed. The last sound Evangeline heard as she was taken from the mansion was Vivienne's voice, painfully sweet. "Emmeline, dear, go to your room now. Mommy needs to make an important call." The governess felt a chill run down her spine at the tone used by Vivienne, and something in her instinct told her that this was only the beginning of a much bigger nightmare. As the patrol car doors closed, Evangeline couldn't stop thinking about Emmeline's guilty expression and Vivienne's victorious smile. What dark game was being played in that mansion? And why did she have the terrible feeling that little Emmeline was somehow at the center of it all? Hours later, the metallic creak of the cell door echoed through the cold prison corridors as Evangeline was pushed inside. Her governess uniform, once immaculately white, was now crumpled and stained after hours of booking procedures. The bun in her hair, always so neatly arranged, was starting to come undone, grey strands falling over her pale, tired face. An older inmate sitting on the top bunk interrupted her reading to observe the newcomer with critical eyes. "Another madame falling from her heels," she muttered, loud enough for all the other inmates in the corridor to hear. The cramped space of the cell seemed to suffocate Evangeline, who remained standing near the entrance, her hands still trembling slightly. The thin mattress of the lower bunk exuded a musty smell that made her stomach churn, painfully reminding her of the scented sheets she used to change in the mansion. The grey walls, scribbled with marks from other inmates, seemed to close in on her like a cruel trap. A raspy voice came from somewhere down the corridor. "Hey, white apron lady, how much did you steal from your mistress? Must have been a fortune to end up here with us." The sound of malicious laughter echoed down the hallway, making Evangeline clutch her arms around her body as if she could shield herself from the taunts. Her thoughts flew to Emmeline, imagining the girl alone in the mansion, probably still crying. The memory of the child's guilty look before her arrest still deeply troubled her. A young inmate passed by the front of her cell, stopping to stare at her with a crooked smile. "Look at that fancy one, girls. We got ourselves a mansion governess. I wonder if she knows how to clean cells too." The cellmate of Evangeline climbed down from the bunk with an agile movement, revealing herself as a tall, thin woman with tattooed arms and a look that had seen too much of life. She approached slowly, circling Evangeline like a vulture, examining every detail of her uniform. "So you're the new sensation? The maid who stole the jewels from the rich lady? I saw your face on the news earlier. You don't look like the type who steals, but you never know, do you?" Her tone was a mixture of curiosity and veiled threat that made Evangeline feel a shiver run down her spine. The hours dragged like days as Evangeline remained standing, unable to sit on the bed assigned to her. The constant noise of voices, shouts, and slamming doors created an infernal symphony that seemed to pierce her eardrums. A prison guard walked past the cell, banging her baton on the bars. "Whitmore, your uniform arrived. Change out of those madam clothes now." The sharp order was followed by more laughter from the other inmates, who crowded at their cell bars to watch the maid's transformation. The orange prison uniform weighed in her hands as if made of lead. Evangeline looked at her white apron one last time, her hands caressing the familiar fabric as if it were the skin of a loved one. 20 years of honest work reduced to suspicion and humiliation. Her cellmate let out a sound of impatience. "Get on with it, princess. This ain't like the madam's mansion, you know. If the guard tells you to change clothes, you better obey before they decide to help." The process of changing clothes was torture. Each piece of her maid's uniform that Evangeline removed seemed to take with it a piece of her dignity. The other inmates watched with cruel interest, making comments and jokes about her fair skin and uncalloused hands. "Look how delicate she is. Must have broken a nail stealing those jewels," someone shouted, sparking a new wave of laughter. Evangeline tried to ignore them, but each word was like a needle piercing her already fragile soul. Dressed in the orange prison uniform, Evangeline finally sat down on the edge of the lower bunk, her eyes fixed on the concrete floor. The creaking of the mattress springs seemed to echo throughout the cell, officially marking her entry into this new world. Her cellmate returned to the upper bunk, resuming her reading as if nothing had happened. "Welcome to hell, maid," she said, her voice carrying a tone of dark amusement. "I hope you're tough because from what I heard in the corridors, some of the inmates are already planning to give the madame's thief a proper welcome." The sun was beginning to set, painting the cell walls with blood-orange shadows. Evangeline closed her eyes, trying to focus on the image of Emmeline, the innocence of her smile, the purity of her love. But even those sweet memories now came tainted by the guilty expression she had seen on the girl's face moments before her arrest. A cruel doubt began to form in her mind. Was there something about this story that she wasn't seeing? The sound of more inmates approaching her cell brought her back to brutal reality. "Hey, maid," called a rough voice. "Yard time tomorrow. Can't wait to show you how we treat Madame's thieves around here." The harsh morning light punished the prison yard when Evangeline first stepped onto its cracked concrete. The orange uniform, still stiff and rough against her skin, set her apart from the other inmates who had faded their clothes over time. The air was charged with palpable tension, and Evangeline could feel dozens of hostile gazes following her every move. Her cellmate had whispered a warning before they left. "Stick close to the wall and don't meet anyone's eyes." They're looking for any excuse. A group of inmates playing cards in a corner of the yard began to stand up, like predators preparing for an attack. Evangeline recognized some of the voices that had taunted her the day before among them. The leader of the group, a burly woman with scars on her arms, began walking toward her. The other inmates positioned themselves strategically, forming a semicircle that blocked any escape route. "So this is the famous maid who robbed her employer?" said the leader, her voice dripping with scorn. "Must have learned a lot about fine jewelry cleaning the madam's room, huh?" The circle of inmates slowly closed around Evangeline, who tried to remain calm despite her pounding heart. One of the younger women, with a cruel smile, shoved her hard in the shoulder. "Tell us, Auntie, what's it like robbing someone who trusts you? Must be easier than mugging on the street, right? You just had to smile and look all saintly for 20 years. The others laughed, and Evangeline tasted the bitter flavor of fear in her mouth. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'm innocent." This only provoked more laughter and mockery. The group leader moved even closer, her hot breath on Evangeline's face. "Innocent? There ain't nobody innocent here, darling. But at least we own up to what we do. You're worse, pretending to be all proper while stealing on the sly." Her words were like poison, sinking deep into Evangeline's already wounded soul. The other inmates began chanting in unison, "Madame's thief! Madame's thief!" The sound echoed across the yard, drawing more spectators into the tightening circle. One of the most aggressive inmates purposely bumped into Evangeline, making her stagger. "Oops, sorry, madame." "I'm not used to such fine people around here," she provoked, eliciting more laughter from the group. Evangeline tried to regain her balance, but another push came from the opposite side. It was like a cruel game of cat and mouse, and she was clearly playing the role of the mouse. The guards watched from a distance, apparently uninterested in what was happening. One of them even yawned, as if it were just another normal day in prison. The siege continued to close in, and Evangeline could feel the cold sweat running down her back. The leader of the group grabbed a strand of her gray hair, pulling it gently. "Do you know what we do with thieves in here? Especially those who steal under a mask of sainthood." Her voice had a threatening tone that made Evangeline tremble. The other inmates drew closer and closer, their expressions ranging from cruel amusement to genuine anger. One of them spat on the ground near Evangeline's feet. "People like you disgust me. At least we don't pretend to be what we're not." The scorching sun turned the courtyard into a furnace, but Evangeline felt an inner chill that no heat could melt. Her thoughts flew to Emmeline, to the moments of peace in the mansion's kitchen, to the stories she told the girl. The memory of the guilty expression on the child's face returned with full force, and something inside her grew stronger. "You can think what you want," she said, her voice low but firm. "But I know who I am." This seemed to further enrage the group. The leader grabbed the collar of her uniform. "Oh, really? Then let's see who you really are, little saint." A taller inmate positioned herself behind Evangeline, completely blocking her view of the guards. The group leader smiled threateningly. "You know what's worse than a thief? A thief who doesn't own up to what she is." She gave a subtle nod of her head, and Evangeline felt strong hands grabbing her arms. Panic began to take over, as she realized there was no escape. The voices around her blended into a sinister chorus. "Show her how we treat Madame Thieves." The circle of inmates was now so closed that Evangeline could barely see the sky above. The air seemed increasingly scarce, and she could feel the hatred emanating from those women. The leader approached again, her eyes shining with calculated cruelty. "Now you're going to learn what real life is, governess. Here there's no rich mistress to protect you, no spoiled little girl for you to deceive. Welcome to your true place." The sound of snapping fingers echoed through the courtyard, and Evangeline felt her heart stop for a moment, knowing the worst was yet to come. The first blow caught Evangeline in the stomach, robbing her of air from her lungs. Her legs weakened, but the hands that held her kept her upright, forcing her to face more. The sharp pain made her vision darken for a moment, and in that instant of despair, she felt something fall from her pocket, a small folded photograph she had managed to hide during the search. The paper slid across the courtyard floor, stopping at the feet of the group's leader, who picked it up with a wicked smile. "What do we have here? A memento of the good life?" she taunted, unfolding the photo with rough fingers. The image revealed Emmeline smiling, sitting at the kitchen table with a hot chocolate, taken in one of those simple moments of happiness that now seemed to belong to another life. Evangeline felt her heart tighten as she watched the group leader examine the photograph with growing interest. The other inmates drew closer to see, and whispers began to circulate. "It's the mistress's daughter," someone commented, and the tone of the voices changed subtly. The leader looked back at Evangeline, her eyes now carrying something beyond the initial cruelty. There was curiosity and perhaps a hint of confusion. "Why do you keep the girl's picture? To remember what you stole from her?" Evangeline found strength she didn't know she had, straightening herself despite the pain throbbing in her body. "Emmeline is like a daughter to me," she said, her voice choked but firm. "For 20 years I watched her grow up, dried her tears, told her stories to fall asleep. You can call me whatever you want. You can beat me, but never doubt the love I feel for that child." Her words carried such raw truth that for a moment the entire courtyard fell silent. The group leader looked at the photo again, her face hardened by life in prison, showing a fleeting shadow of emotion. An older inmate approached, observing the photograph over the leader's shoulder. Her eyes softened for a moment. "My daughter was that age when I ended up here," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. The comment seemed to touch something deep within the women around her. Several of them were mothers who hadn't seen their children in years, and the photo of Emmeline with her innocent smile was like a mirror of their own losses. The group leader slowly folded the photograph, her face an impenetrable mask. "Why do you still keep this? It'll only hurt more," she said, her voice now carrying a different tone. Evangeline extended a trembling hand for the photo, and to her surprise, the leader returned it without resistance. "Because deep in my heart, I know there's something wrong with this whole story," Evangeline replied, caressing Emmeline's image with gentle fingers. "That girl, the look in her eyes when they took me away, there was something different." As if she knew something, the words came out before she could stop them, and Evangeline realized it was the first time she had voiced that gnawing suspicion inside her. Some inmates exchanged meaningful glances, as if recognizing something familiar in her story. The atmosphere in the courtyard changed subtly. The circle of women still surrounded Evangeline, but the initial hostility had given way to a cautious curiosity. The leader crossed her arms, studying Evangeline with experienced eyes. "You really believe it was a setup? That someone planted the jewels in your bag?" The tone of her voice was no longer mocking, but of genuine interest. Evangeline held the photo to her chest, as if she could protect Emmeline and all the good memories through that simple gesture. "I can't explain it," she replied. "But for 20 years I've worked in that house. Why would I steal something now? And why would I leave the jewels in my own bag?" One of the younger inmates, who had been quiet until then, stepped forward. "The mistress. How did she react when she found the jewels?" The question caught Evangeline by surprise, making her relive the moment in her mind. She didn't seem surprised," she answered slowly, as if realizing it for the first time. "In fact, she had already called the police before even searching my bag." Murmurs of understanding ran through the group. Several of the women there knew well how setups, injustices, and power games worked. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, marking the end of the sunbathing hour. The guards began to move, preparing to lead the inmates back to their cells. The group leader took a step toward Evangeline, her posture still intimidating, but her eyes carrying a different glint. "Listen well, governess. If you're telling the truth, you need to find out what really happened. Because one thing I've learned in here, sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who hurt us the most." With those words, She gestured for the group to disperse, leaving Evangeline alone with her thoughts and the crumpled photograph of Emmeline. As she walked back to her cell, Evangeline felt every muscle in her body protesting with pain, but her mind was strangely clear. The leader's words echoed in her head, mingling with the image of Emmeline's guilty look and Vivienne's triumphant smile. Holding the photo against her chest, Evangeline whispered a promise to herself. "I'll uncover the truth, my little one, even if it's the last thing I do." At that moment, a specific memory began to form in her mind, something she had seen at the mansion days before her arrest, a seemingly unimportant detail that now took on new meaning. Her heart began to beat faster with the realization perhaps the key to her freedom was hidden in her own memories. Emmeline remained curled up on the simple bed in Evangeline's room, her small hands clutching the governess's pillow as if it were a life preserver in the midst of a storm. The servants' room, usually so tidy and cozy, now seemed cold and empty without the presence of her beloved Evangeline. The beige curtains swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, bringing in the scent of the garden that the governess loved to tend. The girl's tears stained the white pillowcase as she whispered to herself, "Why aren't you here, Evangeline? Why don't you come back to tell me stories?" The shrill sound of sirens cut through the silence of the mansion, causing Emmeline to lift her head from the pillow. Through the small window, she saw 2 police cars entering the main gates, escorting a car where her 16-year-old brother Gideon was in the back seat. The teenager laughed and chatted with 2 other boys, seeming more bored than worried, as if this situation was just a minor inconvenience in his day. "Not again, Gideon," Emmeline muttered, noticing that her brother wore the same expensive clothes as always, now stained with spray paint. The sound of slamming doors and raised voices downstairs made Emmeline curl up even tighter on Evangeline's bed. Her father, Sterling's deep voice, mingled with the firm voices of the police officers, while Gideon responded in a mocking tone she knew well. Vivian, her mother, used that controlled, icy tone as always. "Not again." As if the scandal with the governess wasn't enough, "You had to embarrass us even further," Gideon replied with a disdainful laugh. "Oh, come on! That old lady got arrested anyway. What's the difference?" Emmeline slid off the bed and approached the room's door, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. Through the small gap, she could see the movement in the entrance hall reflected in the large wall mirror. Gideon stood between 2 police officers, his school uniform covered in paint, an arrogant smile on his face as he checked messages on his phone, completely oblivious to the chaos he had caused. "Mr. Sterling," said one of the officers, "your son was caught vandalizing the wall of the historic district along with other youths. The damages are considerable." Vivian paced back and forth, her heels marking each step like a relentless metronome. "Gideon, do you realize what's happening? The press is already all over us because of that theft story, and now this?" The teenager just shrugged, his eyes still fixed on his phone screen. "Big deal. Everyone's already forgotten that Evangeline story. No one cares about a maid anyway." Emmeline felt her heart tighten as she heard Evangeline's name mentioned so dismissively by her brother. Sterling climbed the stairs with heavy steps, probably going to retrieve the necessary documents from his office. As he passed the corridor, he paused briefly in front of Evangeline's room door, where Emmeline was hiding. The girl held her breath, fearing she would be discovered, but her father just let out an irritated sigh and continued on his way, muttering something about the problems Gideon was causing the family's reputation. From downstairs, the teenager could be heard complaining about having to go to the police station. "What a drag, I missed tonight's party because of this nonsense." Gideon began climbing the stairs, still typing on his phone while an officer followed him. As he passed Evangeline's room, he didn't even glance at the door, as if that space and everything it represented meant absolutely nothing to him. "I need to change these clothes," he said, his voice laden with boredom. "I can't stand this paint smell anymore. Evangeline always used to wash my clothes when I got dirty. Now it's going to be a pain to have to wait for the new maid to learn." Emmeline felt more tears streaming down her face as she heard her brother talk about Evangeline, as if she were just another replaceable employee. Vivienne remained in the hallway, her voice now lower as she discussed with the other officer how to cover up the case. "We already have enough problems with that governess story. We don't need any more negative exposure." Emmeline sat down on the floor, her back resting against the cold wall, feeling the weight of loneliness more than ever. Without Evangeline, there was no one in the mansion who really cared about her feelings, no one to wipe away her tears or tell stories that made the world seem less scary. The chaos continued to unfold in the mansion as Emmeline remained hidden in her dear Evangeline's room. In the midst of all that confusion, her eyes landed on the small bedside table where the storybook they used to read together rested. It was then that something caught her attention, a small piece of paper sticking out between the pages, something she had never noticed before. Her heart began to beat faster, and amid the tears, a small flame of hope ignited in her chest. Could it be, she thought, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her dress, could it be that Evangeline left something for me? The mansion's office turned into an arena when Sterling forcefully closed the door. Facing Gideon, who remained distracted by his cell phone, the fresh paint stains still on his expensive clothes. Emmeline, who had silently followed through the hallway with Evangeline's apron clutched to her chest, slipped into the room before the door closed completely, hiding behind one of the heavy velvet curtains. "Can you put that cell phone down for a minute?" Sterling shouted, his voice trembling with anger. Gideon merely rolled his eyes, purposefully putting the device in his pocket with slow motion. Vivian entered the office, her heels echoing on the noble wooden floor. Her red nails drummed on the desk as she watched her son with a mixture of irritation and disdain. "Do you have any idea of what's happening, Gideon? First that scandal with the governess, and now you're caught vandalizing public property." The teenager let out a mocking laugh, slumping into an expensive armchair. "Please, Mother, no one remembers that Evangeline story anymore. She was just a maid who stole some jewels. It happens all the time." Emmeline clutched the apron tighter against her chest, feeling her heart ache with her brother's carelessness. Sterling approached his son, his face red with fury. "Just a maid? Is that how you see things? That woman worked 20 years in this house, and you—" Gideon interrupted his father with a bored gesture. "Exactly, Father. 20 years cleaning, cooking, doing her job. Big deal. She wasn't family, she was an employee, and apparently a dishonest employee." Vivian adjusted her perfectly styled hair, a cold smile on her lips. "Well, at least on that you're right, son. She was just a maid who took advantage of our trust. But don't change the subject. What were you thinking when you defaced that wall?" Gideon stood up, walking slowly towards the window. "I was thinking I was bored, that this house is a bore, that I need to have some fun. Pick the answer you prefer." Sterling banged his fist on the table forcefully, making Emmeline jump in her hiding place. "Amusing? You call this amusing? Do you have any idea how much it's going to cost to repair that damage? Not to mention the embarrassment of having my son taken away by the police." Gideon let out another mocking laugh. "Ah, Father, relax. Just pay the fine and it's done. It's not like we're going to go broke over it." "We didn't go broke when Evangeline took all those expensive jewels, did we?" Vivienne approached her son, her expensive perfume suffocating the room. "You're going too far, Gideon. Your father and I have decided enough is enough. You're going to boarding school." For the first time, the arrogant smile faltered on the teenager's face. "What? You can't do that. And my parties? My friends?" Sterling took a step forward, his voice cutting. "We can and we will. Here it's all arranged. You're leaving early tomorrow." Gideon began pacing the office like a caged animal. "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything that bad. Everyone tags walls, everyone has fun. You can't just send me away because of that." Vivienne crossed her arms, her voice icy. "It's not just because of that, and you know it. It's everything. Your behavior is out of control. Maybe a few months away from your bad influences will put some sense into your head." The teenager angrily kicked a chair. "Bad influences? Look who's talking. You're the ones who hired a thief to look after the house." Emmeline felt hot tears stream down her face as she heard Evangeline insulted once again. Sterling advanced towards his son. "Enough, you're going to boarding school and that's final. And be grateful it's not somewhere worse after what you did today." An involuntary sob escaped Emmeline's lips from her hiding place, making everyone freeze for a moment. Vivienne frowned, looking towards the curtain. "Is someone there?" The girl's heart stopped for an instant, and she clutched Evangeline's apron even tighter, wishing the governess was there to protect her. Gideon, completely oblivious to the tense moment, just huffed irritably. "Great, now the crybaby Emmeline must be eavesdropping. Just what I needed." Emmeline held her breath behind the curtain as Vivienne began to approach. Evangeline's apron in her small hands still held the soft scent of vanilla from the kitchen, and in that moment of fear, memories flooded her mind like stars appearing in a dark sky. She remembered the first time Evangeline had found her crying under the kitchen table after yet another of the parties, where her parents had left her alone with her rebellious brother, who hadn't even noticed her absence. The governess hadn't asked questions. She had simply sat down on the floor beside her, offered a cup of warm milk and cookies, and begun telling stories about princes who were actually frogs, and frogs who were actually princes, until her sobs had turned into laughter. The sound of Vivienne's heels approaching mingled with other memories. Evangeline drying her tears after no one had shown up for her piano recital at school. While Gideon was at yet another of his forbidden parties, and her parents busy with social events, it had been Evangeline who was there. "Sometimes, my love," the governess had said that day, hugging her tightly, "the people who are supposed to protect us most are too busy with their own lives. But that doesn't mean you're alone." Emmeline remembered how Evangeline had spent the entire night playing piano with her in the kitchen, applauding every note, as if it were a concert in the grandest theatre in the world. The memories kept coming, growing more intense with each one. The night Gideon had come home completely out of it, breaking things and yelling at everyone. While her parents argued over how to handle the situation, it was Evangeline who had taken Emmeline to her staff room, shielding her from the chaos. "Did you see the stars out the window, little one?" Evangeline had whispered, rocking her gently. "They look distant and alone, but they're actually forming the most beautiful constellations. That's how it is with us. Even when it seems like we're alone, our love forms a special constellation." Vivienne was only a few steps away from the curtain now. Emmeline could feel her mother's overpowering perfume mingling with the familiar scent of Evangeline's apron, creating a contrast that made her stomach churn. Another memory surfaced, more recent. Evangeline finding her awake in the middle of the night, scared by the sound of the police taking Gideon home once again. The governess had brought her to the kitchen as she always did, and as she prepared a soothing tea, she had hummed a lullaby softly. "I know, little one," Evangeline had said that night. "Sometimes love is like this tea, it needs time and care to become perfect." Gideon's shouts at his father continued in the office, his voice full of selfishness and defiance. "You can't send me away. It's not fair." Emmeline squeezed her eyes shut, another memory taking shape. The day she had found Evangeline crying alone in the garden, after a particularly cruel argument with Vivienne. It was the only time she had seen the governess display weakness, and even then, upon noticing her presence, Evangeline had quickly dried her tears and offered a smile. "Sometimes we cry not because we're sad," she had explained, pulling Emmeline into an embrace, "but because our heart is so full of love that it overflows." Emmeline's heart was beating so loudly that she was sure everyone could hear it. The voices in the office now seemed distant, submerged under the weight of the memories that kept coming. The last morning with Evangeline in the kitchen, the hot chocolate, the laughter, and then... Emmeline felt a wave of guilt so strong that her legs weakened. She remembered Evangeline's look when the police took her away, a look that wordlessly asked, "Why?" The same question that now echoed in her mind, mixed with her mother's threatening voice that morning. "If you tell anyone anything, Emmeline, our family will be destroyed. Is that what you want?" Vivienne was about to pull the curtain when a new Gideon's outburst diverted her attention. "I'm not going to any school, you don't boss me around." The sound of heels retreated, and Emmeline let out the breath she hadn't even realized she was holding. Her little hands still clutched Evangeline's apron, now wet with her tears. One last memory surfaced, so vivid that she could almost feel the gentle governess's touch on her face. "Little one," Evangeline would always say, "the truth is like a seed. No matter how hard they try to bury it, it always finds a way to sprout and grow toward the light." Emmeline looked at the apron in her hands, and then at the storybook in Evangeline's room, where that strange paper was still waiting to be discovered. Her childish heart, heavy with secrets too big for her age, began to beat in a different rhythm. Her parents' and rebel brothers' voices continued to echo through the office, but now there was something new growing inside her, a determination born from the mixture of all those memories of love and protection. "Forgive me, Evangeline," she whispered to the apron, "but I can no longer keep this secret. You taught me that true love always chooses the path of truth." The Hargrove Mansion's dining room glistened under the light of the large crystal chandelier as the family gathered for what should have been a normal meal. The new maid, still unsure of the house's routine, served the dishes with trembling hands, clearly intimidated by Vivian's imposing presence. The silence was broken only by the clinking of the silver cutlery and the irritating sound of Gideon's phone, which kept receiving messages. Emmeline barely touched her food, her eyes constantly straying to the empty spot where Evangeline used to stand, always ready to serve more juice or bring a clean napkin. Sterling watched his wife over the rim of his wineglass, his eyes fixed on the new sapphire necklace adorning Vivienne's elegant neck. The jewel shone almost provocatively under the chandelier's light, as if wanting to draw attention to itself. The new maid spilled some sauce on the linen tablecloth while serving Vivienne, who merely rolled her eyes in disdain. Evangeline would never have made such a basic mistake, she said, her voice laden with irony. Well, at least this one doesn't steal jewels, does she? Sterling's cutlery clattered loudly against the porcelain plate, making Emmeline shrink in her chair. Curious that you should mention jewels, Vivienne, he said, his tone calculatedly casual. I don't recall seeing that necklace before. Is it new? Vivienne's hand automatically went to her throat, her fingers caressing the blue stones. Gideon finally took his eyes off his phone, suddenly seeming interested in the conversation. Oh, this? Vivienne replied with a tense smile. It's a gift I gave myself. After all that stress with that ungrateful woman's arrest, I deserved something to cheer me up. The new maid discreetly withdrew from the room, feeling the growing tension in the air. Sterling took a long sip of wine before continuing. Interesting, because since Evangeline was arrested, I've noticed several new jewels in your drawers. Curious coincidence, don't you think? Vivienne froze with her fork halfway to her mouth, while Gideon let out a mocking laugh. Dad, are you insinuating that Mum is the thief now? As if. Emmeline watched it all with wide eyes, her heart beating faster and faster. The silence that followed was thick as fog, broken only by the sound of Gideon's phone, which the teenager finally decided to silence. Sterling set down his cutlery with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving his wife's face. Actually, Gideon, I was thinking of another possibility. Evangeline was arrested 2 weeks ago, but objects keep disappearing. Today I even missed a watch. And you, son, have been coming home with new clothes and sneakers that I don't remember buying. Gideon's arrogant smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Vivienne placed the linen napkin on the table with unnecessary force, her red nails contrasting with the white fabric. I can't believe you're doing this, Sterling. First you defend that thief, and now you're accusing your own son. Emmeline watched her brother out of the corner of her eye, noticing how he had paled slightly under his nonchalant air. Gideon began playing with the food on his plate, avoiding his father's piercing gaze. How ridiculous, Dad. Just because that old lady was a kleptomaniac, now everyone who has something new is a suspect. The air in the dining room grew heavier and heavier, as if the crystal chandelier was pressing everyone down with its weight. Sterling leaned forward in his chair, his eyes now fixed on Gideon. Funny you should use the word kleptomaniac, son. As far as I remember, you barely spoke to Evangeline, said she was just an insignificant maid. Since when have you been so interested in her case? Vivienne dropped her wineglass, staining the tablecloth red, but no one moved to clean it up. Emmeline gripped the cutlery so tightly that her little fingers were starting to hurt. Gideon pushed his plate away, his mask of indifference starting to crack. Come on, Dad, you really want to start this story now? Wasn't all the drama from this morning enough? Sterling ignored his son's provocative tone, his voice taking on a dangerously calm timbre. Yes, the drama from this morning. You being brought in by the police, covered in paint, after vandalizing public property. I wonder where all this destructive behavior comes from, son. What else have you been destroying besides walls? Vivienne tried to intervene, her voice trembling slightly. Sterling, enough. Gideon is going to boarding school tomorrow. There's no need to make our last family dinner even worse. But Sterling hadn't finished. His eyes roamed the table, from his wife with her new necklace to his restless son, and finally to Emmeline, who seemed to want to disappear into her chair. You know what's most interesting? The jewels started going missing long before Evangeline was arrested, but back then no one thought to search anyone else's bag, did they? Vivienne stood up abruptly, knocking her chair over with a clatter that echoed through the dining room. Her fingers were trembling as she ripped the sapphire necklace from her neck, throwing it forcefully onto the table. "How dare you? How dare you insinuate that I or Gideon had anything to do with those jewels? That woman was caught red-handed." Her normally controlled voice now rose several octaves, making Emmeline shrink even further into her chair. The necklace slid across the wine-stained tablecloth, coming to a stop near the girl's untouched plate. Sterling remained seated, his eyes fixed on his wife in a relentless scrutiny. "Red-handed? You mean when you coincidentally decided to search her bag on that specific morning?" Vivian slammed her hands on the table with such force that the glasses trembled. "Don't try to turn this around. I protected this family. That maid was robbing us for months." Gideon watched the scene with unusual interest, his phone forgotten in his lap, while Emmeline couldn't take her eyes off the fallen necklace on the table. Vivian's face was red with rage as she began pacing the room, her heels marking each step like gunshots. 20 years. I gave that ingrate 20 years of employment, allowed her to get close to my daughter, to practically live in this house, and how does she thank me? By stealing. Sterling got up as well, his voice dangerously calm. "It's interesting how you mention the 20 years, Vivian. 20 years of impeccable service, and suddenly she decides to start stealing, just as Gideon starts having money problems." Vivian let out a hysterical laugh that made the chandelier crystals tinkle. "Ah, so that's it? You're defending a thief against your own son? Against your wife? What's happened to you, Sterling? Where is your loyalty to the family?" Her red nails dug into the wooden table as she leaned towards her husband. Gideon shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face alternating between pallor and flush. Emmeline watched it all with wide eyes, her little hands clutching the napkin under the table. The new maid chose that moment to enter with dessert, but froze at the door, sensing the tension in the air. Vivian turned towards her like a snake about to strike. "Out! Get out!" The woman dropped the tray in shock, the sound of shattering porcelain mingling with the screams. "See? This is what happens when we hire just anyone to replace that viper. This house has been chaos since Evangeline was arrested, and you still have the audacity to defend her." Sterling rounded the table, approaching his wife with measured steps. "I'm not defending anyone, Vivian. I'm merely making interesting observations, like the fact that you found the jewels in Evangeline's purse on the very day Gideon was to be confronted about missing money from the office." Vivian staggered as if slapped, her hands flying to the throat where her necklace had once been. "How could you? Are you spying on me? Is that it? Did you hire someone to watch me?" The sound of something hitting the floor made everyone turn. Gideon had dropped his phone, his hands visibly shaking as he tried to pick it up. Vivienne immediately switched her tone, her voice taking on a saccharine sweetness. "Darling, don't let your father upset you. He's clearly distraught over this whole situation. After all, Evangeline deceived him for so long." Sterling cut her off with a sharp gesture. "No, Vivienne. The only one who is clearly distraught here is you, and I'm starting to wonder why." Vivienne grabbed a crystal goblet, gripping it so tightly her fingers turned white. "Distraught? Distraught? You want to see distraught, Sterling? How about I call the papers right now and tell them how the great businessman prefers to defend a thieving maid over protecting his own family, how he suspects his own teenage son, how he doubts his wife's word." The glass in her hand began to dangerously creak under the pressure. Emmeline squeezed her eyes shut, dreading the moment the crystal would give way. The crystal goblet finally shattered in Vivian's hand, exploding into thousands of tiny shards that glittered under the chandelier light. A few drops of blood began dripping from her cut palm, staining the white tablecloth already spattered with wine. The sound of breaking glass seemed to awaken something in Gideon, who now sported an almost imperceptible smile at the corner of his lips. Emmeline, still huddled in her chair, noticed a subtle shift in her brother's posture. It was as if he was watching a particularly entertaining show. Vivienne looked at her bleeding hand with an oddly detached expression, as if the pain did not affect her. "Do you see what you've made me do, Sterling?" she whispered, but there was something different in her voice now. Emmeline noticed that her mother's hands, always so steady and elegant, were trembling in a way she had never seen before. It wasn't the tremble of anger from moments ago, it was something deeper, more nervous, almost like guilt. "This is all your fault," Vivienne continued, but her eyes avoided meeting her husband's. Gideon leaned back in his chair, toying with one of the crystal shards between his fingers, his smile growing minutely with each drop of blood that fell from his mother's hand. Emmeline watched, fascinated as her brother seemed strangely gratified by all this chaos. It wasn't his usual teenage indifference. There was something more there, something calculated in his apparent nonchalance. "Mother," he said in a melodically calm voice, "I think you need to calm down. We wouldn't want anything else to break now, would we?" The double meaning in Gideon's words was not lost on Emmeline. She noticed how her mother froze for a second, shooting a quick, frightened glance at her son, before resuming her hysterical performance. It was as if there was a silent conversation happening between the two of them, something that went far beyond the words spoken aloud. Sterling began to approach Vivian with a clean napkin for her cut, but she recoiled as if his touch could burn her. "Don't come near me. You've ruined everything. First defending that thief, now this." Emmeline noticed something odd about her mother's recoil. She hadn't just shied away from Sterling, but also from the sideboard drawer near the table. The same drawer where Evangeline used to keep the fancy napkins, and where Emmeline had seen her mother furtively rummaging some nights ago. An apparently insignificant detail, but one that now seemed to scream in her mind. Gideon was also looking at the sideboard, his smile widening a fraction more. "Yeah, Dad, why can't you just accept the official version of events?" Gideon's choice of words made Emmeline frown. Official version. That's how her brother referred to the excuses he made up when he was caught in his messes. She watched as he exchanged a quick glance with their mother, who immediately brought her hand to her neck where the necklace had been before, a gesture Emmeline had seen dozens of times when her mother lied about something. It was the same gesture she made on the morning when Evangeline was arrested. "Official version?" Sterling repeated slowly, his gaze alternating between wife and son. Vivian quickly tried to regain control of the situation, but Emmeline noticed how her hands kept trembling. "Gideon is just nervous about going to boarding school tomorrow, isn't he, dear?" But there was a pleading tone in her voice that Emmeline had never heard before. Gideon's smile now had a tinge of cruelty that reminded the girl of her mother's expression when she had Evangeline arrested. "Of course, Mother," he replied, spinning the shard of crystal between his fingers. "After all, we all have to pay for our mistakes, don't we?" Emmeline felt her heart race when she realized her mother had paled at Gideon's words. It was as if her brother was provoking not only her father, but also her mother. And then, in a flash of understanding, Emmeline realized there was someone else being manipulated at that table besides Evangeline. Her mother was not only hiding something, she also seemed to be afraid of something. Or someone. The hidden paper in Evangeline's storybook seemed to weigh even more heavily on her conscience. Sterling watched the whole scene with increasingly suspicious eyes. "Interesting how the two of you seem so aligned in your concerns." Vivienne let out a shrill, almost hysterical laugh. "Of course we're aligned. We're a family. A family you're trying to destroy with your crazy accusations." But Emmeline saw the way her mother looked nervously at Gideon before finishing the sentence. It was the same look she, Emmeline, gave her mother every time she was forced to hide something. The little girl felt a chill run down her spine as a new possibility began to form in her mind. Was her mother also being blackmailed? The prison's visitors' room seemed even smaller, with the presence of the public defender. A middle-aged man with deep under-eye circles and a battered briefcase on the metal table. Evangeline, still uncomfortable in her orange uniform, watched as he spread colored photographs across the metallic surface. Her heart stopped for a moment as she recognized the jewels. The emerald necklace Vivian wore at important parties, the diamond earrings that were kept in the safe, the sapphire brooch that had belonged to the family for generations. "Mrs. Evangeline," the defender began, his voice weary, "I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. This necklace alone is worth over $2 million. Evangeline felt the air leaving her lungs as more photographs were laid out on the table. Her hands, now calloused from the forced labor of prison, trembled as she touched the images. Each piece of jewelry represented a different moment from her 20 years in the mansion. She remembered helping Vivienne choose them for events, carefully storing them in their velvet boxes, teaching them to Emmeline, who loved to play princess. The defender adjusted his worn glasses before continuing. "With the total value of the jewels, we're talking about charges that could result in life imprisonment. The Hargrove family is very influential, and they want to make an example. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening as Evangeline tried to process this information. Through the small barred window, she could see other inmates in the courtyard, their lives reduced to the same orange uniform that now defined her existence. "But I didn't steal anything," her voice came out as a whisper. "I worked 2 decades in that house. Why would I steal something now?" The defender sighed heavily, pulling more documents from his briefcase. "The problem, Mrs. Evangeline, is that all the evidence points to you. The jewels were found in your bag, there are witnesses, and your bank account." Evangeline's head snapped up at the mention of her account. "My account? What about my account?" The defender shuffled through some papers before finding a bank statement. There were suspicious deposits in the last few months. Small amounts, but regular. The prosecution claims you were selling the jewels little by little. Evangeline felt her blood run cold. Those deposits, she knew exactly where they came from, but explaining the truth could jeopardize everything. "It's not what it seems," she muttered, feeling the weight of the secret she carried. The photographs seemed to glow with an accusing light under the cruel illumination of the room. The defender kept pulling more documents out of his briefcase, each paper seeming like a new stone in her gravestone. "There are also records of suspicious calls, Mrs. Evangeline. The police traced calls to known fences for stolen goods." Evangeline felt her legs weaken, even while seated. Those calls, again, the truth behind them was very different from what it appeared. But how could she explain without compromising others? The sound of keys and gates opening and closing in the distance constantly reminded Evangeline of where she was. The defender adjusted his glasses again, a gesture she was already starting to recognize as a sign of bad news. "The family is demanding full restitution in addition to the maximum sentence. They claim your position of trust makes the crime even more egregious. Vivian Hargrove has already given several interviews to the press talking about how betrayed she feels." The mention of Vivian's name left a bitter taste in Evangeline's mouth, remembering her former employer's triumphant smile on that fateful morning. The defender began organizing the photos into piles, separating them by estimated value. Evangeline watched every move, her mind drifting back to Emmeline, imagining how the girl would be coping with it all. "Mrs. Evangeline," the defender's voice brought her back to the present. "I need you to be completely honest with me. Was anyone else involved? Someone who might have put the jewels in your bag? Any information can help us build your defense." Evangeline felt tears forming in her eyes, but she held them back. She couldn't reveal her suspicions, not yet, not without being certain. The clock on the wall ticked away relentlessly, each tick seeming like a hammer blow to her sentence. The defender took one last photograph from his folder. It was the watch found in her bag, the one that had started the whole investigation. "This watch," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "has a tracking system. The family managed to prove that it had been in places related to the sale of stolen goods." Evangeline felt her world spin. That watch, she had never seen it before that morning, but now it was connecting her to places she had never visited. A knock on the door indicated that visitation time was coming to an end. The defender began to gather the photographs and documents, his slow movements carrying the weight of years dealing with seemingly lost cases. "Mrs. Evangeline," he said, closing his briefcase, "tomorrow your family will come visit you for the first time. I suggest you think carefully about what you're going to tell them. Sometimes the truth is not the best path when the evidence is so compelling." Evangeline felt her heart tighten. How would she explain all of this to her family? How would she make her own relatives believe in her innocence when all the evidence said otherwise? The prison visitation day had a different air. A mixture of expectation and shame hung in the air as Evangeline waited in the visitor's room, her restless hands smoothing the orange uniform that shamed her so much. The sound of the heavy door opening made her heart jump, and then they entered. Her older sister Coraline, her brother-in-law Everett, and her 17-year-old niece Isolde. The shock on their faces at seeing her in that state was like a stab in her chest. Coraline brought her hands to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. "My God, Evangeline, what have they done to you?" Evangeline tried to get up to hug them, but the guard quickly reminded her of the rules. No prolonged physical contact. Her sister seemed to have aged years since the last time she saw her, just a few weeks ago. Coraline sat across from her, tears flowing freely down her face. We haven't slept properly since we found out. How could you, Evangeline? 20 years in that house. Everyone in the neighborhood is talking. No one believes." Her sister's words were like salt in an open wound, making Evangeline feel the weight not only of her own shame, but of the impact on her entire family. Everett remained standing, his eyes roaming the room as if seeking an explanation on the grey prison walls. Isolde, whom Evangeline had watched grow up and had always been a second mother to, could barely look in her direction. "Auntie," her niece began, her voice trembling, "the principal called me in yesterday. She said it might be better if I drop out of my teaching degree. Who's going to want to hire a teacher with an aunt convicted of theft?" Evangeline felt as if each word was a brick in a wall rising between her and her family. How to explain that her innocence meant protecting another child? Coraline took a folded newspaper out of her purse, her hands shaking as she opened it. "It's all over the news, Evangeline. The Hargrove family won't stop giving interviews. That woman, Vivian, she tells how you betrayed their trust, how you played with their daughter while stealing their jewels." Evangeline closed her eyes, the image of Emmeline invading her mind. She wanted to scream the truth, tell them about the suspicious calls, the mysterious deposits, the little girl's guilty look. But how to explain something she herself didn't fully understand? The prison environment seemed even more oppressive with the presence of her family. The constant noise of gates and keys mingled with Coraline's muffled sobs. Everett finally sat down, his deep voice laden with disappointment. "Evangeline, we sold the car to pay for a private lawyer. He says the evidence is very strong. The deposits in your account, the calls, the GPS watch. How are we going to explain all of this?" Evangeline felt her hands tremble at the thought of her family getting rid of possessions to help her. "You didn't need to do that," she murmured, knowing no lawyer could help without knowing the whole truth. Isolde finally found the courage to look her directly in the eye. "Auntie, you were always our role model. Remember when you encouraged me to go to college? You said honesty and hard work were the most important things." Her voice faltered, and Evangeline felt her heart break at the disappointment in her niece's eyes. The weight of the secret she was keeping seemed even greater now, seeing the impact of her silence on the lives of people she loved so dearly. How to explain that sometimes protecting someone means hurting others? Coraline took her sister's hands across the table, ignoring the guard's warning look. "Why, Evangeline? If you needed money, why didn't you come to us? We've always shared everything." Evangeline felt hot tears streaming down her face. How to explain that the deposits in her account had another origin? That the suspicious calls were part of something bigger? That there was a frightened child in the middle of all this? "It's not what you're thinking," was all she could say, her voice choked. Visitation time was ending, and Evangeline could see the desperation growing in her family's eyes. Everett tried one last time. "Evangeline, if you know something, you need to tell us. We can't help if we don't know the truth." She shook her head, feeling the weight of her choices. "Sometimes the truth can hurt more people than it protects," she replied, knowing her words would only increase her family's doubts. The look they exchanged said it all. They were starting to believe she was really guilty. The guard announced the end of the visit, and Evangeline watched her family rise. Coraline hugged her quickly, her stifled sobs against her shoulder. "We'll try to raise more money for the lawyer. We're not giving up on you." Isolde hesitated before coming in for a quick hug, and Evangeline could feel her niece's body tense, as if hugging a stranger. Everett just nodded his head, his parting words heavy as lead. "Think hard about what you're doing, Evangeline. Your family is being destroyed by this secret." As she watched her family leave, Evangeline felt the full weight of her situation. The orange uniforms seemed to suffocate her, the prison walls closing in even tighter. Her sister's last words echoed in her mind. "Come back to us, Evangeline. Whatever the truth is, it can't be worse than losing you." But as the heavy door closed, Evangeline thought of Emmeline, the paper hidden in the storybook, the pieces of the puzzle that still didn't fit. "Forgive me," she whispered to the family that could no longer hear her. "But some truths need the right moment to be revealed." Evangeline still felt the scent of her sister's shampoo in the air when the public defender returned to the visitors' room. Her tears had barely dried, and the weight of her family's disappointment still hung on her shoulders like a lead cloak. The defender sat across from her, rummaging through his worn briefcase until he found some documents. His tired face showed a mixture of compassion and resignation as he began to speak. "Mrs. Evangeline, after seeing your family, perhaps you'll be more willing to consider the deal the prosecution is offering." First, the paper he slid across the metal table seemed harmless, but his words were like sharp knives cutting the little hope she had left. "If you confess to the theft now and return the remaining jewels, the sentence could be reduced to 10 years, with the possibility of parole after 3. Evangeline felt her stomach churn. 10 years. Emmeline would already be a teenager when she got out, at least 3 years before she could hug her family again, all for a crime she didn't commit. "And if I don't accept?" Her voice came out stronger than she expected. The defender sighed heavily, removing his glasses to clean them with a worn handkerchief. "Without the deal, we're talking up to life in prison due to the family's influence and how the media is giving extreme attention to this scandal. The Hargrove family has influence, Mrs. Evangeline. They want to make an example out of this case." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Evangeline closed her eyes, remembering Emmeline's smile, the paper hidden in the storybook, the pieces of the puzzle that still didn't make sense. "I can't confess to something I didn't do," she replied, her hands trembling on the table. A heavy silence settled in the room as the defender observed her with a mixture of frustration and admiration. "Mrs. Evangeline, I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. Your family is disowning everything to try to help you. Your niece could lose the future she fought so hard for. Are you sure it's worth sacrificing all of that to maintain a denial that no one believes?" Each word was like a blow to her already bruised heart, but Evangeline remained firm. The image of Emmeline's frightened face that morning was still vivid in her mind. Tears began to stream down Evangeline's face as she shook her head. "You don't understand. I can't lie. I can't say I stole something when I know I didn't steal it. What kind of example would I be for Emmeline?" She trailed off abruptly, realizing she had mentioned the girl. The defender leaned forward, suddenly interested. "Emmeline, the Hargrove's daughter. She has something to do with this?" Evangeline felt her heart race, knowing she had said too much. The defender began scribbling rapid notes on his notepad. "Mrs. Evangeline, if there's something involving the girl, you need to tell me. This could completely change the case." But Evangeline had already retreated back into herself, the fear in Emmeline's eyes that morning still haunting her memory. "No," she said firmly. "There's nothing to tell about Emmeline. I just miss her." The defender studied her for a long moment, clearly not believing her words, but knowing he wouldn't get any more information. The sound of footsteps in the hallway and clanging gates echoed as a constant reminder of where they were. The defender gathered his papers slowly, his voice now softer. "Mrs. Evangeline, you still have a few hours to think about the deal. Think about your family. Sometimes the truth isn't as important as protecting those we love." Evangeline felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. That was exactly what she was doing, but not in the way he imagined. Evangeline stood when the guard came to retrieve her, her legs shaking slightly. "I won't confess to something I didn't do. No matter how long it takes, the truth will come out." The defender tucked the unsigned deal into his briefcase, his face looking older than ever. "May God help you then, Mrs. Evangeline, because the way things are, only a miracle can save you now." As she was led back to her cell, Evangeline whispered to herself, "I don't need a miracle, I just need Emmeline to find the courage to do the right thing." The prison corridor seemed longer and darker that afternoon. Each step was like a hammer pounding her sentence, each gate a reminder of the consequences of her choice. But as other inmates watched her pass, some with pity, others with disdain, Evangeline kept her head held high. In her mind, a specific memory began to take shape. Something she had seen at the mansion days before her arrest, a detail that had seemed unimportant at the time. "Forgive me, Emmeline," she thought, "but some truths need time to ripen, like the stories I used to tell you." Emmeline was standing at Gideon's bedroom door, her small body trembling with nervousness while holding something in her hands. Her brother was lounging on his bed, headphones at full volume, completely ignoring her presence as he always did. The girl took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she could before entering the room uninvited. "Gideon," she called, her voice firmer than she felt, "we need to talk." Her brother merely rolled his eyes, turning his attention back to his phone. I have nothing to say to you, brat. Tomorrow I'm off to boarding school anyway, so leave me alone. The late afternoon light streamed through the bedroom window, casting elongated shadows that seemed to dance across the poster-covered walls. Emmeline clutched at what appeared to be a crumpled piece of paper in her hands. More jewels have gone missing, Gideon, even with Evangeline locked up. The governess's name finally made Gideon remove his headphones, a mocking smile appearing on his lips. So what? What does that have to do with me? Are you going to cry over your nanny again? Emmeline took a step forward, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. How could more jewels have disappeared if Evangeline is locked up? She can't be the thief. Gideon sat up on the bed, his face assuming an expression of cruel boredom that Emmeline knew all too well. It was the same one he wore when he deliberately broke her toys. Listen up, you crybaby. Nobody cares about your precious Evangeline, okay? She was just a servant who got too big for her boots. Now she's paying the price. Emmeline felt tears forming in her eyes, but she held them back. She had learned from Evangeline that sometimes we need to be strong, even when we want to cry. But what about the noises I heard last night? Someone was in Mum's room, rummaging through her drawers. The room grew darker as the sun set, but neither sibling made a move to turn on the lights. Gideon abruptly stood up, his height making Emmeline take a step back. You've been snooping around too much, you know? Just like that meddlesome old woman. Want to end up like her? The veiled threat in his voice made Emmeline tremble, but she held her ground. You know something, don't you? That's why you're so calm about going away to school. Gideon grabbed his sister's arm forcefully, his fingers leaving red marks on her delicate skin. Shut your mouth, you don't know anything. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Gideon quickly drop Emmeline's arm. Vivienne passed through the door, casting a questioning look at her children. What are you doing in the dark? Emmeline rubbed her sore arm, noticing how her mother seemed nervous, her hands constantly adjusting the necklace she wore, one she had never seen before. Nothing, Mum, Gideon replied, resuming his bored teenage pose. The brat is just whining because she'll miss her little brother. Vivienne smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Emmeline, dear, let your brother pack his bags in peace. After Vivienne left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Emmeline watched her brother return to the bed, acting as if she didn't exist. The girl clutched the paper in her hands tighter. Don't you really care about Evangeline? After all the times she protected you, lied to our parents about your troubles? Gideon let out a cold laugh that made Emmeline shudder. Protected me? She made a fool out of me, that's what. She pretended to be the saint, the second mother. Now everyone knows who she really is. The last ray of sunlight abandoned the room, leaving the siblings in the half-light. Emmeline took one last look at Gideon, who had returned to isolating himself with his headphones. I know there's something wrong with this whole story. And I'll find out what it is, even if you don't help me. Gideon removed one of his headphones, his face partially illuminated by the screen of his cell phone, assuming a somber expression. If I were you, I'd stop looking for answers, sis. Some truths are too dangerous for little kids like you. Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine at the threatening tone in his voice. Emmeline was already at the door when she heard Gideon mutter something that made her blood run cold. Besides, you wouldn't want Mom to find out you've been snooping, would you? She gets so nervous when people mess with her stuff. The girl clutched the paper in her hands even tighter, feeling her heart racing. There was something in Gideon's voice, an insinuation she didn't fully understand, but that deeply frightened her. What do you know about Mom? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. The only response was Gideon's cold laughter, followed by the loud sound of music leaking from his headphones. Emmeline remained at the door, her small hand still clutching the crumpled paper. The darkness of the room was now only broken by the bluish light of Gideon's cell phone, casting strange shadows on his face. What did you mean about Mom? She insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Gideon slowly removed his headphones, a cruel smile playing on his lips. You know what's funny? Your precious Evangeline is locked up, but Mom keeps showing up with new jewelry every day. Curious, don't you think? The sound of a door slamming somewhere in the mansion made the two siblings jump. Gideon rose from the bed, approaching Emmeline with calculated steps. And you know what's even more interesting? How Mom always knows when something is going to happen. How she knew exactly when to search Evangeline's bag. His voice had a macabre tone of amusement that made Emmeline take a step back, feeling the cold wall against her back. "You're saying that is Mom?" She couldn't complete the sentence. Gideon let out a low, humorless laugh. "What I'm saying, sis, is that sometimes people aren't who they pretend to be. Evangeline pretended to be this saint you adored, but she was a thief, and Mum, well, let's just say she has her own secrets." Emmeline felt her legs weaken, remembering all the times she had seen her mother acting strangely in the past few weeks. The whispered phone calls, the constantly locked drawers, the nervous smiles whenever someone mentioned Evangeline. The teenager returned to his bed, picking up his phone and typing something with a disturbing calm. "But you know what's best of all? I don't care. Evangeline is locked up? Big deal. She was just another meddling maid who thought she could interfere in our lives." Emmeline felt tears of rage streaming down her face. "How can you be so cruel? Evangeline took care of you, defended you so many times." Gideon raised his eyes from the cell phone, his gaze as cold as ice. "Defended me? She was paid to do that, idiot. And now she's paying for sticking her nose where it didn't belong." The sudden realization hit Emmeline like a bolt of lightning. You knew. You knew all along that Evangeline was innocent." Gideon shrugged, a calculatedly casual gesture that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. "Innocent is a strong word, sis. Let's just say I know things that would make your head explode. But unlike your precious Evangeline, I know when to keep my mouth shut." The sound of high heels in the hallway made the two fall silent momentarily, waiting until Vivian's footsteps faded away. Emmeline felt her world spinning, all the pieces starting to fit together in a terrible way. "That's why you agreed to go to boarding school so easily, isn't it? You made some kind of deal." Gideon stood up again, his height intimidating when he stopped right in front of his sister. "Listen up, you crybaby. Sometimes it's better to stay out of things. Evangeline didn't know how to do that, and look where she is. You want to end up like her?" The threat in his voice was as clear as crystal. The night wind blew through the window, making the curtains dance like ghosts in the dark room. Gideon leaned closer to Emmeline, his hot breath on her face as he whispered, "Mom may seem fragile and elegant, but you have no idea what she's capable of when she feels threatened. Why do you think Dad never found out about the money troubles? About the strange phone calls?" Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine, remembering her mother's gaze on that fateful morning. Gideon threw himself back onto the bed, grabbing his headphones as if the whole conversation was just a minor inconvenience. "But you know what's even more pathetic? Evangeline is probably still there, keeping her mouth shut, thinking she's protecting you. Little does she know you're just a pawn in a much bigger game." Emmeline felt her heart tighten at these words, the image of Evangeline in her cell making her eyes burn with fresh tears. "How can you be so cold?" she asked, her voice choked. The teenager put his headphones back on, his smile now crueler than ever. "It's not about being cold, sis, it's about survival. Evangeline chose to play the hero, and look where it got her. Me? I choose the winning side, always." He turned up the volume of his music, a clear sign that the conversation was over. But before Emmeline could leave the room, he added in a sing-song voice that made her blood run cold, "Oh, and if I were you, I'd be very careful with what you do with your little discoveries. You're not the only one Mum's watching closely." Emmeline waited until she heard the sound of the shower running in the master bathroom to sneak into her parents' bedroom. Her heart was pounding so hard that she feared someone might hear it. Gideon's words still echoed in her mind as she silently closed the door behind her. The room was dim, lit only by the bedside lamp, casting shadows that seemed to watch her. The girl knew she had little time. Her mother never took more than 15 minutes in the shower. Vivian's closet was an environment that had always fascinated Emmeline. Rows of expensive dresses, perfectly aligned shoes, and the special section where the jewelry was kept, or at least where it should have been kept. The girl noticed that several velvet boxes were empty, even though her mother continued to wear different jewelry every day. With trembling fingers, Emmeline began to examine the drawers of the vanity, being careful to memorize the exact position of each object so she could put them back later. It was then that her fingers touched something hidden under a pile of silk handkerchiefs, a thin brown folder that she had never seen before. The sound of running water in the bathroom seemed deafening as Emmeline carefully opened the folder. Inside, she found several receipts and folded papers. Her hands were shaking so much that she almost dropped one of them, but something caught her attention. They were pawn shop receipts, dated weeks before Evangeline's arrest. The amounts were extremely high, but what really made her heart stop was recognizing the signature at the bottom of each receipt. A signature she knew well, for she had seen her mother use it thousands of times on her school authorizations. A noise in the hallway made Emmeline freeze, but it was just the wind slamming a door somewhere in the house. With nimble fingers, she continued examining the papers, finding more receipts, all dated before Evangeline's arrest. There were also papers with phone numbers written down, some crossed out in red ink, others circled. At the bottom of the folder, something made her blood run cold. An old photo of Evangeline, clearly taken without her knowledge, talking to a man Emmeline didn't recognize. On the back of the photo, a note in her mother's handwriting, Evidence 1, Suspicious Meetings. The sound of the shower suddenly stopped, sending Emmeline into a panic. She quickly began putting everything back in place, but her hands were shaking so much that one of the receipts slipped out, sliding underneath the vanity. The girl's heart seemed to want to jump out of her mouth as she bent down to retrieve it. It was then that she noticed something else, a small black notebook hidden at the back of the bottom drawer. Emmeline knew she didn't have time to take it, but she managed to see a few words written on the first page. Plan, Phase 1, Discredit. Emmeline barely had time to put the last paper back in the folder and hide it under the handkerchiefs before hearing her mother's footsteps approaching the room. She silently slid back behind the curtains, the same place where she had hidden during the argument in the study. Vivienne entered the room, wrapped in her silk robe, drops of water still dripping from her hair. Emmeline watched through a small gap in the curtain as her mother went straight to the vanity, opening the handkerchief drawer as if she needed to check something. Vivienne's sigh of relief upon finding the folder intact was almost imperceptible, but Emmeline noticed it. She watched her mother pick up the phone and dial a number, her voice taking on a tone the girl had never heard before. Everything is going according to plan. Gideon leaves tomorrow, and that woman is still keeping her mouth shut. But we need to get rid of all the evidence we can't risk. Emmeline felt her heart stop when her mother suddenly looked toward the curtain, as if she had sensed her presence. Vivienne abruptly hung up the call, her eyes fixed on the curtains that were gently moving with the night breeze. Emmeline held her breath, feeling the paper receipt she had managed to hide in her pocket burning against her skin. Her mother took a step towards the window, but stopped when Gideon appeared at the door. "Mom, what time is my passage tomorrow?" Vivienne turned to her son, but Emmeline noticed how her eyes returned to the curtain one last time before answering. "At 9, dear. Everything is ready for your trip." The smile on her lips did not reach her eyes, which held a calculating gleam that Emmeline had never noticed before. Emmeline held Gideon's old phone in her trembling hands, hidden in the hallway leading to her parents' bedroom. Her brother had left the device behind when he got a new one, and now it could be the key to uncovering the truth. The girl had observed a pattern in recent weeks. The jewels always disappeared on Wednesday nights when her father had late meetings and Gideon was in his extra classes. It was a Wednesday, and the clock showed 7 o'clock in the evening. Emmeline's heart was beating so hard that she feared someone might hear it as she snuck into her parents' bedroom. Her hands were sweating as she held the phone, remembering the instructions Evangeline always gave about courage. "Sometimes, little one, we need to be strong even when we're afraid." The late afternoon light cast strange shadows in the room, and every creak of the wooden floor made her stomach churn. "I need to be strong for you, Evangeline," she whispered to herself, approaching the dressing table where she had found the receipts. Vivienne was downstairs, her voice echoing as she spoke on the phone. Another one of those suspicious calls that had become so frequent. Emmeline took the opportunity to examine the room, looking for the best place to hide the phone. Her eyes landed on the artificial flower arrangement on the dressing table. The angle was perfect to capture the entire area where her mother usually handled the jewelry. With nimble fingers, she positioned the device among the flowers, carefully adjusting the camera so that it was completely concealed. The sound of Vivienne's steps on the stairs made Emmeline freeze for a moment. Quickly, she checked if her phone was recording and well hidden, her heart almost stopping when an artificial petal moved slightly. She managed to slip back behind the curtains, her usual hiding spot, just seconds before her mother entered the room. Vivienne seemed agitated, pacing back and forth while still talking on the phone. Yes, I need to resolve this today. We can't wait any longer. Emmeline held her breath, watching through the crack in the curtain. The minutes dragged like hours as Emmeline remained motionless in her hiding spot. Her legs were starting to ache, but she didn't dare move. Vivienne finally ended the call and left the room, but the girl knew she needed to wait longer. Her mother always came back to check if she was truly alone. The trick Evangeline had taught her about patience echoed in her mind. When we really want something, little one, sometimes we need to wait for the right moment, like when we wait for a cake to be ready in the oven. The distant sound of the front door opening announced her father's arrival. Emmeline heard Vivienne's voice downstairs, artificially cheerful. "Darling, I thought your meeting would take longer." It was her cue. Her mother always kept Sterling occupied for at least half an hour before going back upstairs. With her heart pounding, Emmeline left her hiding spot and checked the phone one last time. The blinking red light indicated it was recording, and the camera had a clear view of the entire vanity area. A movement in the hallway made Emmeline hide again, this time behind the folding screen in the corner of the room. Gideon walked past the door, briefly stopping to look inside the room. For one terrifying moment, Emmeline thought her brother might notice something was amiss, but he only let out a bored sigh and continued on his way. The girl waited a few more minutes before sneaking out of the room, her legs shaking with adrenaline. "Forgive me, Mom," she thought, "but I need to know the truth." Dinner that night was torture. Emmeline could barely touch her food, her eyes constantly returning to the upstairs, where her phone kept recording. Vivienne seemed more restless than usual, checking her own phone every few minutes. "Emmeline, dear, you're so quiet," her father commented. The girl forced a smile, feeling the weight of her secret in her chest. "I'm just tired, Dad. It's been a long day." Vivienne shot her daughter a piercing look, as if trying to read her thoughts. Emmeline went up to her room as soon as she could, but she couldn't sleep. Every minute that passed was agony, knowing that at some point her mother would come upstairs for her mysterious nightly activity. The clock on her nightstand showed 10 o'clock when she finally heard it. The soft sound of footsteps in the hallway, her parents' bedroom door closing quietly. Emmeline hugged her teddy bear, the same one Evangeline had given her on her last birthday, and whispered a prayer. "Please let me be doing the right thing." The sun had not yet risen when Emmeline silently slid out of her bed. She had patiently waited until she heard her father's soft snores and her mother's rhythmic breathing through the thin wall separating their rooms. Barefoot to avoid making noise, she crept down the dark hallway to her parents' room. Her heart was beating so hard she feared she might wake the whole house, but she needed to retrieve the phone before anyone found it. The artificial flowers were still exactly as she had left them, the phone perfectly camouflaged among the petals. With trembling fingers, Emmeline retrieved it, taking care to rearrange the arrangement so it looked untouched. A movement in the next room, Gideon gathering the last of his things for his departure, made her freeze for a moment. But her brother was too preoccupied with his own troubles to notice the small figure sneaking back down the dark hallway. Safe in her room, Emmeline hid under the covers with the phone, creating a small tent with her blanket, like she used to do with Evangeline when they read stories together. The bluish glow of the screen illuminated her tense face as she navigated to the recordings from the previous night. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the device when the first image appeared, her mother, Vivienne, entering the room shortly after 10 o'clock. The video showed Vivienne moving purposefully around the room, her movements precise and calculated, very different from her usual ethereal air. Emmeline watched in horror as her mother opened a false drawer at the back of the vanity, a compartment she had never known existed. From inside, Vivienne retrieved several pieces of jewelry that were supposedly stolen by Evangeline. But what made Emmeline's blood run cold was seeing her mother pick up the phone and dial a number, her voice taking on a tone the girl had never heard before. "Everything is ready for tomorrow. With Gideon at the boarding school, no one will connect the dots." Emmeline's heart felt like it was going to beat out of her chest as she continued watching. Vivienne moved closer to the window, where the moonlight illuminated her normally beautiful face, now twisted into a calculating expression. That idiot Evangeline is still holding firm, thinking she's protecting Emmeline. Little does she know she's exactly where we wanted her. Emmeline had to cover her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming out loud. Her mother continued, "No, don't worry. Sterling is completely distracted by the suspicions about Gideon." Everything is going according to plan. The tears blurred Emmeline's vision, but she couldn't stop watching. The video showed Vivian putting some jewels into a small velvet bag while continuing her phone conversation. The next pieces are already set aside. With the money from selling these, we can cover all the casino losses without Sterling finding out. And Evangeline? Well, she's going to spend a good amount of time in prison thinking twice before trying to blackmail me again. Emmeline felt her world spinning as she heard those words. Blackmail? Evangeline would never do that. The video continued, showing Vivian organizing papers, the same receipts Emmeline had found before. The plan worked perfectly, her mother said on the phone. That old busybody found out about my gambling debts and thought she could threaten me. I had to get rid of her before she told Sterling. Gideon was a good boy, did exactly what I asked. A little extra money and the promise of not telling his father about his messes were enough to ensure his cooperation. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Emmeline quickly turn off her phone, her heart beating like a drum. She waited, holding her breath until the footsteps faded away. When she turned the device back on, the video showed the final moments of the night, Vivian carefully putting everything away and making one last call. So everything is set for tomorrow then. With Gideon away and Evangeline in jail, no one will suspect. Emmeline, don't worry about her. She's just a scared little girl who will do anything her mother tells her to keep the family together. The recording ended, leaving Emmeline sitting on her bed, shaking uncontrollably. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit. Her mother's debts, Gideon's blackmail, the setup against Evangeline. Her beloved governess was imprisoned, suffering, just because she had discovered the truth about Vivian and tried to protect the family. And now, Emmeline was the only one who knew everything. The weight of that discovery seemed too great for her small shoulders. Emmeline sat on the floor of her room, back against the wall, the phone still in her trembling hands. Tears streamed silently down her face as her mind replayed every moment of the video. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, announcing that Gideon would be leaving in a few hours. The sounds of the house waking up, running water, doors opening, footsteps in the hallways, seemed distant, as if she were in a bubble of sadness and confusion. "What do I do now?" she whispered to the teddy bear Evangeline had given her, as if it could have the answer. Her eyes rested on the photograph on her nightstand, her and Evangeline in the garden, both smiling, the governess teaching her to plant flowers. The memory of that day was so vivid. The smell of damp earth, the shared laughter, Evangeline explaining that some seeds need time and courage to bloom. "Like that seed, little one," Evangeline had said. "Sometimes we need to have courage to grow, even when the world seems dark." Emmeline clutched the phone to her chest, feeling the weight of the truth it held. The sound of her mother's voice in the hallway made her heart race. Vivian was on the phone again, her tone sweet and controlled, the same voice she had used to have Evangeline arrested, to manipulate Gideon, to deceive her father all this time. Emmeline thought of all the nights Evangeline had comforted her after nightmares, how the governess had always known exactly what to say to make the world seem less scary. Now Evangeline was living a real nightmare, alone in a cold cell, and all for trying to protect her. Her fingers slid across the phone's screen, re-watching snippets of the video. Every word from her mother felt like a stab. The gambling debts, the blackmail, the plan to frame Evangeline. Emmeline thought of her father, always so busy with work that he didn't notice what was happening in his own home. She thought of Gideon, choosing money and silence over the truth. And she thought of her mother, the woman who was supposed to protect her, but who hadn't hesitated to destroy an innocent life to hide her own mistakes. The first lights of dawn began filtering through the window, bathing the room in golden hues that seemed to mock the darkness in her heart. Emmeline slowly stood up, approaching the mirror. Her red, tear-stained eyes met her own reflection, and for a moment she saw a glimmer of the determined look she so admired in Evangeline. "What would you do?" she asked her reflection softly, remembering the words the governess had always repeated. "The truth can hurt, little one, but lies hurt even more." The noise of suitcases being dragged down the hallway indicated Gideon was getting ready to leave. Emmeline looked again at the phone in her hands, the only concrete proof of Evangeline's innocence and her mother's guilt. Revealing the truth would mean exposing her family, possibly seeing her mother imprisoned, facing shame and scandal. But staying silent would condemn Evangeline to years of unjust incarceration, betraying the person who had always protected and loved her unconditionally. Vivienne knocked on her door. "Emmeline, darling, come say goodbye to your brother." Her mother's voice, so familiar and now so strange, made Emmeline shudder. She glanced one more time at the photo with Evangeline, at the teddy bear, at the phone holding the truth. Evangeline's words on her last day at the manor echoed in her mind. "Always be brave, my love, even when it seems impossible." Emmeline felt fresh tears roll down her cheeks, but this time they were different. No longer tears of confusion, but of determination. The sound of the front door opening announced Gideon's imminent departure. Emmeline tucked her phone into her pocket, feeling its weight as if she carried the entire world. She wiped away her tears with the back of her hands, straightened her shoulders, as she had seen Evangeline do so many times when facing difficult situations. "Forgive me, Mama," she whispered to the empty room. "But Evangeline taught me that true love means doing the right thing, even when it hurts." Emmeline opened her bedroom door, the phone secure in her pocket, the truth weighing on her heart. Each step toward the stairs seemed harder than the one before. Her mind turned to Evangeline, alone in her cell, staying strong and silent to protect her. "Now it's my turn to protect you," thought Emmeline, descending the steps toward what she knew would be the end of her innocent childhood. In her pocket, the phone seemed to pulse with the truth that would forever change the lives of everyone in the mansion. The courthouse corridors seemed endless as Emmeline ran, her little feet echoing on the marble floor. Her lungs burned with the effort, but she couldn't stop. Not when she knew the judge was about to pronounce the sentence that would condemn Evangeline to life in prison. The phone weighed in her pocket like an anchor of truth, thumping against her leg with every desperate stride. Behind her, she could hear her mother's voice shouting her name, but it only made her run faster. The courtroom was packed that morning, reporters and onlookers crowding the hallways to see the outcome of the case that had garnered so much attention. Emmeline slipped between people, her heart beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from her chest. Through the double wooden doors of the courtroom, she could hear the judge's deep voice beginning the final proceedings. "Please," she whispered between gasping breaths, "please don't let me be too late." Vivienne was a few meters behind, trying to reach her daughter without drawing too much attention. Emmeline could feel the desperation in her mother's steps, knew she had understood what was about to happen when she saw the girl taking Gideon's old cell phone. "Emmeline, stop right now." Vivienne's voice sounded more threatening with every moment, but the girl only thought of Evangeline's face, of how her governess had remained silent all this time to protect her. The courtroom doors were now just a few meters away, guarded by 2 court officers. Emmeline could hear the judge speaking about the evidence presented, about the gravity of the crime. Her legs trembled with exhaustion and fear, but she couldn't stop, not when she was so close. One of the guards saw her approaching and began to extend his arm to stop her. "Hey girl, you can't!" But Emmeline was small and agile, the result of all the games of chase with Evangeline in the mansion's garden. The air inside the courtroom felt heavy with expectation. Emmeline saw Evangeline sitting in the defendant's box, still wearing the orange prison uniform, her graying hair looking even whiter under the fluorescent lights. The judge was standing, his papers organized in front of him, ready to pronounce the sentence. Sterling, her father, was in the front row, his face a mask of disappointment directed at the former governess. No one expected to see a child bursting into the room at that solemn moment. The seconds seemed to stretch like hours as Emmeline ran down the center aisle of the room. She could hear the murmurs of surprise from those present, the sound of the court officers trying to reach her, her mother's voice now tinged with real panic. Someone stop her! But none of that mattered. Her eyes met Evangeline's, and in that moment all the strength she needed returned to her tired legs. "Evangeline," she shouted, her voice echoing off the courtroom walls, "I know the truth. I have proof." The judge banged his gavel, demanding order in the courtroom as chaos erupted. Vivienne finally managed to enter, her normally composed face now twisted into a mixture of anger and fear. Sterling stood up, confused by his daughter's sudden appearance. Evangeline remained motionless in her place, her eyes fixed on Emmeline, a blend of love and worry in her gaze. The girl reached the central area of the room, right in front of the judge's bench, her small hands trembling as she took the cell phone from her pocket. The sound of more people entering the room, guards and court officers, created a new wave of confusion. Emmeline clutched the cell phone like it was the most precious object in the world, tears now streaming freely down her flushed face from the effort. "Your Honor," her childish voice rang out surprisingly clear amidst the tumult. "Please, you need to see this before sentencing Evangeline. She's innocent. I can prove it." Vivian took a step forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Emmeline, darling, you don't know what you're doing." The judge watched the scene with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when something important was about to happen in his courtroom. Emmeline remained steadfast, even with her legs shaking, even with her mother trying to reach her, even with all the confusion around her. Her eyes found Evangeline's again, and she saw something that gave her the final strength she needed: pride. The same pride she saw when she hit a difficult note on the piano, when she learned a new word, when she faced her fears. "Evangeline always taught me to do the right thing," she said, her voice now stronger, "even when it's hard. And that's what I'm going to do now." The judge motioned for a projection screen to be brought in, while Emmeline, still trembling, handed the cell phone to a court officer. Vivian tried to intervene, her voice taking on that sweet tone that now sounded false to her daughter's ears. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. My daughter is just a confused child who—" But her words were cut off as the first image appeared on the screen, herself in the bedroom, removing jewelry from the secret compartment. An absolute silence fell over the room as the video began to play. Vivian's voice filled the space, clear and ruthless. "That idiot Evangeline is still holding firm, thinking she's protecting Emmeline." Sterling rose from his chair, his face paling with each new revelation. The words continued. "With the money from selling these, we can cover all the casino losses without Sterling finding out." Evangeline, in the defendant's box, kept her eyes fixed on the screen, silent tears streaming down her face. The video continued to reveal every detail of the scheme: the gambling debts, the manipulation of Gideon, the framing of Evangeline. With each new revelation, more gasps of shock rippled through the room. Vivian had collapsed into a chair, her normally composed face now a mask of defeat. "And Evangeline?" Her own voice continued on the recording. "Well, she'll spend a good long time in prison, thinking twice before trying to blackmail me again." Sterling turned to face his wife, decades of trust crumbling in seconds. The bailiffs began to move towards Vivian, while the prosecutor was already standing up, asking for the floor. Emmeline remained standing in the center of the courtroom, her small hands still trembling, but her gaze firm. Evangeline had risen from her seat, restrained only by the presence of the guard beside her. The judge watched it all with a grave expression, making quick notes as the video continued to reveal every detail of Vivian's plan. The final confession on the video echoed through the room. "Gideon was a good boy. He did exactly as I asked." A little extra money and the promise not to tell his father about his troubles were enough to secure his cooperation. Sterling covered his face with his hands, his world crumbling before his eyes. The prosecutor was already calling for Vivian's immediate arrest and the dismissal of the charges against Evangeline. Emmeline finally allowed her legs to give way, sliding to the floor as she sobbed. Evangeline was granted permission to approach Emmeline, kneeling beside the girl and enveloping her in her arms. "You were so brave, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Vivian watched the scene with a mixture of rage and despair as the officers approached her with handcuffs. The judge banged his gavel, his deep voice cutting through the murmuring that had taken over the courtroom. "In view of the new evidence presented, I hereby immediately suspend the sentence against Evangeline Whitmore." The controlled chaos that followed seemed to happen in slow motion. Vivian being handcuffed, Sterling trying to process all that he had discovered, reporters trying to enter the courtroom to record the sensational reversal. But for Emmeline, none of that mattered. She was in Evangeline's arms, the only place she had ever truly felt safe. "Forgive me," the girl whispered, "for not speaking up sooner." Evangeline only held her tighter, her tears mingling with Emmeline's. "You had nothing to be forgiven for, little one. You saved my life." The judge's voice rang out again, now directed at Vivienne. "Mrs. Hargrove, you are hereby remanded into custody for perjury, obstruction of justice, fraud." The list of charges continued, each word making Vivienne shrink further into her chair. Emmeline watched her mother, her heart torn between filial love and the justice she knew was necessary. Evangeline, sensing her anguish, whispered in her ear, "Sometimes, my love, Doing the right thing is the truest act of love we can show. One final revelation from the video echoed through the courtroom. Emmeline, don't worry about her. She's just a scared little girl who will do whatever her mommy says to keep the family together. Those words, which had once been a veiled threat, now rang with the greatest irony. Emmeline had proven herself far stronger than her mother had ever imagined. The judge looked directly at the girl, a rare smile softening his stern features. Miss Emmeline, your courage today not only saved an innocent life, but also showed us that the truth, no matter how painful, always finds its way. It happened in the span of a heartbeat. Vivian, seizing the moment when the officers were speaking with the prosecutor, shoved her chair backward with force and bolted for the side exit of the courtroom. The movement was so sudden that for an instant no one reacted. Her high heels clacked against the marble like gunshots as she ran, her usual elegance replaced by the desperation of a caged animal. "Stop her!" yelled the judge, but Vivian had already reached the door. Chaos erupted in the courtroom as police officers and bailiffs gave chase. Sterling remained rooted in place, as if his legs had turned to lead. Evangeline instinctively pulled Emmeline closer, shielding her from the commotion unfolding. The girl watched, a mixture of horror and sadness as her mother fled like a common criminal, so different from the poised, controlled woman she had always known. Vivian managed to reach the main hallway, knocking people aside in her frantic bid for freedom. Her hair, always impeccably styled, now whipped wildly as she ran. A security guard tried to grab her, but she wrenched free, leaving her expensive coat behind. "Let me through," she screamed, her voice unrecognizable, a mixture of fury and panic. But the courthouse exits were already being blocked by officers alerted to the disturbance. The sound of footsteps and shouts echoed through the courthouse corridors as Vivian, now cornered, looked frantically around for an escape route. Her wide, feral eyes landed for a moment on Emmeline, watching it all unfold from the courtroom doorway, still cradled protectively in Evangeline's arms. For a brief moment, mother and daughter locked gazes, an entire history of love and betrayal contained in that one look. "It's over, Mrs. Hargrove," one of the officers said, approaching cautiously with handcuffs in hand. Vivian backed up until she hit the wall, her expensive dress rumpled, makeup smeared by desperate tears. "You don't understand," her voice shook. "I did this all for my family, to keep up appearances, to protect our name." Emmeline felt Evangeline give her shoulder a gentle, silent squeeze of comfort in the face of her mother's hollow words. Sterling finally managed to move, arriving at the doorway just as the officers reached Vivian. "How could you?" His voice carried the full weight of betrayal. "You destroyed an innocent life, manipulated our son, traumatized our daughter, and you still claim it was for the family." Vivian thrashed as the officers tried to cuff her, her last shred of dignity unraveling into hysterics. "Sterling, please don't let them take me away. Think of the scandal." The reporters were already crowding the corridors, cameras flashing, capturing every moment of the elegant Vivian Hargrove's downfall. Emmeline hid her face in Evangeline's still prison uniform, unable to continue watching. The governess hugged her protectively, whispering words of comfort. "Close your eyes, my love. Sometimes it's better not to see the end of the story." Vivian, now subdued and handcuffed, was still shouting promises and threats, her voice echoing through the courthouse hallways. The judge, who had witnessed the entire scene, gestured for Vivian to be taken away. "Add attempted escape to the list of charges," he ordered, his grave voice cutting through the chaos. As the police officers escorted Vivian towards the waiting squad car, she cast one last glance back, not at her husband, not at the reporters, but at Emmeline, a look that carried thousands of unspoken words, broken promises, and a remorse that came too late. At the end of the corridor, Vivian's last cries could be heard, muffled by the closing of the car door. The reporters now turned their attention to the true heroine of the story, little Emmeline, who chose truth above all else. Evangeline held her tighter, shielding her from the lights and questions. "Let's go home," she whispered, and for the first time in weeks those words truly meant home. The sun shone brightly on the day Evangeline left prison, so different from the gloomy morning when she had arrived there. The heavy gate opened, and she emerged still wearing the orange uniform, but now with her head held high and a serene smile on her lips. To her surprise, she was greeted by a row of inmates, the same ones who had previously harassed her, now applauding in a silent show of respect. The group's leader, the one who had once threatened her, stepped forward. "You taught us that innocence and dignity are not just words, Evangeline. They are choices." Outside, Sterling and Emmeline were waiting. The little girl couldn't contain herself and ran into Evangeline's arms as soon as she saw her, tears of joy wetting the prison uniform for the last time. Sterling approached, visibly emotional. "Evangeline, nothing I can do or say will make up for the harm we caused, but I would like to offer not only compensation, but your job back. Our home is not the same without you." Evangeline hugged Emmeline tighter, feeling the pure love of the child she had always considered her daughter. But she knew that some pages cannot simply be rewritten. With her characteristic gentleness, Evangeline explained her decision. "I bear no grudge, Mr. Sterling. The love I feel for Emmeline is greater than any hurt. But I need a fresh start with my family who has suffered so much." Emmeline cried but understood. Evangeline had taught her that sometimes love means letting go. The former governess promised visits, park meetings, story afternoons. It wouldn't be goodbye, but a new beginning on new terms. That same week, in an ironic twist of fate, Vivian entered through the same gates Evangeline had left. Her expensive jewelry, which she had so prized, was replaced by an identical orange uniform. The same hallway, the same cells, the same contempt she had once encouraged against Evangeline, now directed at herself. The difference was that while Evangeline had never been alone thanks to the love of Emmeline and her family, Vivienne discovered the true meaning of loneliness. On Sundays, the prison yard filled with relatives visiting their inmates. Vivienne would meticulously groom herself, even in the simple uniform, hoping to see Sterling or Emmeline. Hours would pass, the sun would set, and no one would come. Gideon, at his boarding school, never answered her letters. Emmeline, though her kind heart sometimes thought of her mother, was too busy helping Evangeline with her new project, a daycare for underprivileged children. The Seeds of Love daycare was born out of Evangeline's desire to turn her experience into something positive. In a small, colorful building, she now cared for dozens of children, many of them daughters of inmates. Emmeline visited whenever she could, helping to tell stories and plant flowers in the garden, a tradition they maintained. The place became a symbol of how love can blossom even in the most unlikely soils. The last ray of sun came through the daycare window as Evangeline finished the story. Emmeline, who knew the ending well, still had tears in her eyes. They were not tears of sadness, but of understanding, of how difficult choices can lead to more truthful paths, of how courage does not mean an absence of fear, but doing the right thing despite it. Evangeline smiled at her little heroine, knowing that some stories don't need a traditional happily ever after to have the perfect ending. And so, Evangeline concluded to her attentive audience, we learn that family is not only the one we are born into, but the one we choose with our heart, and that true love means doing the right thing, even when it hurts. Emmeline held her hand, and together they looked at the children who represented their new beginning, a future built not on elegant lies, but on simple truths and genuine love. Did you like the story of Evangeline Whitmore and Emmeline Hargrove? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.